When I left the Navy, I wasn't looking for applause. I wasn't looking for recognition medals or titles anymore. After 32 years of service, 20 of which I spent navigating the decks and operations of one of our nation's most powerful aircraft carriers, I only wanted one thing: peace. So I found this sleepy suburban neighborhood in Virginia, tucked behind tall oaks and winding streets, the kind of place with mailboxes shaped like birds and kids who played outside until sunset. The house itself wasn't grand. It was simple, one-story with a screened-in porch and a backyard that sloped gently toward a creek. But to me, it was a palace. After decades of steel walls, tight quarters, and sleeping beneath the roar of engines, the silence of this place was a balm. I bought it outright. No mortgage, no nonsense. Just my space, my rules. At least that's what I thought. I'd lived there 3 months before I attended my first HOA meeting. I didn't go out of interest, really. I just wanted to introduce myself, shake a few hands, and make it clear that I wasn't some recluse or threat. I wore a plain collared shirt, brought a tin of homemade cookies, something my late wife used to do when we moved to a new base. Old habits. What I didn't expect was to be met with cold stares and clipped greetings like I'd walked into a courtroom instead of a community meeting. At the front of the room was Karen Whitmore, HOA President, self-declared neighborhood protector, and woman of very precise taste. She had that posture: tight arms, narrowed eyes, a jaw that clenched even when she smiled. When she asked for new business, I stood to introduce myself. Commander Jack Delaney, retired Navy. Just moved into 310 Elmridge Drive. The room stayed quiet. Karen blinked once, maybe twice. "Oh," she said, lips pursed, "another patriot." The way she said it made it sound like a problem. That was my first warning sign. The second came the next week when I installed a new flagpole out front. Nothing extravagant, just a standard aluminum pole about 15 feet high, flying the American flag during daylight hours. 2 days later, I received a letter from the HOA citing unapproved exterior structures and giving me 10 days to remove it. I chuckled. It wasn't the first time someone underestimated me. I replied with a scanned copy of the community bylaws, highlighting the section that explicitly allowed flagpoles under 20 feet, so long as the flag was appropriately lit or taken down by sunset, which I did religiously. I also attached a photograph of the pole with my driveway and lawn neatly manicured. Karen never responded directly, but I noticed her car drive by slowly every few days after that. Then came the complaints, small at first. A neighbor told me that Karen had brought up the visual dissonance of my home's gray-blue paint at a private meeting, despite it being within the palette listed in the HOA's own design guide. Next, I received another letter, this time about the shape of my mailbox. It was regulation size steel, with my house number clearly printed, but apparently the curve of the top was inconsistent with community standards. That one made me laugh out loud. I kept the letter and added it to a growing file in my home office. Still, I stayed calm. I had faced worse adversaries in foreign waters, dealt with hurricanes, pirates, and diplomatic crises in international zones. Karen Whitmore didn't scare me. But what finally sparked it all happened on a humid Thursday morning in June. I was in my garage restoring a scale model of the USS Harry S. Truman, the carrier I'd commanded for 5 years. The model was nearly 12 feet long, fitted with meticulous details, tiny jets, radar towers, even catapults. It was a personal project, something I worked on with my grandson whenever he visited. That morning, I was fixing a loose propeller on the starboard side when I heard it. The clicking. It was faint at first, but unmistakable smartphone camera shutters. I looked up to see Karen across the street, standing behind her SUV, phone pointed squarely at my garage. I didn't say anything. I just locked eyes with her for a moment and went back to work. About 15 minutes later, she was gone. I figured that was the end of it. Maybe she'd post something passive-aggressive on the neighborhood Facebook page. Maybe she'd write another letter. But at 2:17 p.m., as I was placing the model back onto its base, I heard the sirens. 2 police cruisers rolled down, the street lights on, but no sirens. They stopped right in front of my driveway. My heart didn't even skip a beat. I wiped my hands, stood up straight, and walked out to meet them. That moment, me, standing calmly at the end of my driveway, the officers getting out, glancing down at their notes. It wasn't new to me. I'd been approached by foreign police forces in unstable regions, had MPs question me on the flight deck during emergencies. But never did I think I'd be approached like this in my own peaceful neighborhood because someone found my garage activities suspicious. One of the officers, Officer Ramirez, was respectful. He kept his voice steady. "Sir, we got a call from someone in the HOA about possible unauthorized military construction or activity." I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, "Would you like to see my ID?" He nodded. "That would be great, sir." I handed him my retired Navy identification, my Department of Defense clearance card, and just for good measure, a laminated photo of me saluting on the deck of the Truman next to the Secretary of Defense. Ramirez took one look, then turned to his partner. They both stared for a moment longer than they probably should have. Karen had stepped out of her house by then. Her arms were folded, her phone still in hand, clearly watching for some kind of validation. What she got was very different. Because Ramirez looked back at me and said, "Thank you for your service, Commander. We're sorry to bother you," I nodded. "No problem. Would you like to see the model they did?" And as we walked toward the garage, Karen froze across the street, jaw clenched, realizing the iceberg she had just rammed head first. The day after the police visit, I expected at least a formal apology from Karen, or at minimum, an awkward silence. What I got instead was another letter from the HOA, this time printed in bold font and hand-delivered into my mailbox. No envelope, no signature, just typed words, all capitalized, as if she were shouting. Subject violation, noticery use of garage for unapproved activities. Date June 11, description observed. Operation of unauthorized equipment in breach of Section 2. Response required within 5 business days. I folded the letter in half and laid it gently on my kitchen counter next to the others. The file was growing. I'd served with men who cracked under missile threats, but Karen had the kind of fanaticism that made her feel righteously untouchable, the kind that was more dangerous than any battlefield. For the next week, I kept to myself. I did my yard work, early kept the model aircraft carrier out of sight, and even skipped the next HOA meeting, though I knew my name would be on their lips like a chewing gum stuck to the bottom of their designer sandals. My neighbors had begun noticing too. An older couple across the street, James and Martha, came over one evening with a peach cobbler and the courage to speak in hushed voices on my porch. "She's been doing this to everyone," Martha said, her voice barely louder than a breeze. "Last month, she fined us for keeping our porch light on past 10 p.m. Said it disturbed the nighttime ambiance." James leaned in. "And the year before that, she called animal control on the Sandovals because their golden retriever barked twice in one afternoon." I raised an eyebrow. "Only twice," James said. And she timed it. That peach cobbler didn't last long. More stories trickled in as the days passed. A single mom 3 doors down had her holiday lights forcibly removed for going up 2 days too early. An Iraq vet had his flag lowered by Karen herself when he wasn't home. And an elderly widow had been fined for her front hedge growing half an inch over regulation height. I realized something chilling. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a tyrant in cul-de-sac clothing. What she lacked in real authority, she made up for with legalese-laced letters, intimidation tactics, and an uncanny ability to make every molehill into a mountain range of bureaucracy. She wielded HOA bylaws like blunt weapons, twisting them into whatever form suited her thirst for control. I decided to push back. Not loudly, not with threats, but with precision. The next time I mowed my lawn, I recorded it. Every pass of the mower, every angle of the blade, every slow stop near the driveway edge. I took time-stamped photos. I printed out pages of the HOA landscaping requirements and placed them in a clear binder labeled Lawn Compliance, Commander JD. I even bought a laser distance measurer to verify my mailbox's setback from the curb. She wanted war by paper. I'd survived 27 inspections by naval audit teams. She had no idea what she was up against. A week later, I was trimming a line of shrubs near my fence, brand new shears, quiet electric model gloves, on safety glasses in place when Karen showed up in person. No pretense this time. No smile. Mr. Delaney, she said, her voice sharp. We've received another complaint. Several neighbors are concerned about noise and possible violations related to yard tools and motorized equipment outside of authorized hours. I looked at my watch. 3:26 p.m. Authorized hours. I repeated calmly. According to Section 9 of the HOA guidelines, outdoor tools are permitted between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday through Saturday. She blinked. I continued. Furthermore, my tool operates at 54 decibels, well below the community limit of 65. I have a meter reading if you'd like to verify. Her eyes narrowed like I'd slapped her with her own rulebook. I'm simply trying to maintain the beauty of my property, I added, as encouraged in Article 1. She opened her mouth, then shut it. For the first time, Karen was speechless. She pivoted on her heel and walked away. No more threats, no passive-aggressive comments, no citations left on my door. But I knew her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. The calm before her next escalation. Sure enough, 3 mornings later, I woke up to the sound of a loud conversation in my driveway. 2 HOA board members, Larry Hammond and Susan Park, stood awkwardly near the edge of my lawn. Karen wasn't with them, but her fingerprints were all over it. Larry, a lanky man in his 60s, who always looked like he'd just come back from losing an argument with his tie, cleared his throat. "Jack," he said, "we were wondering if you'd be willing to, perhaps consider keeping some of your projects indoors. You know, just until things calm down." I raised an eyebrow. "Projects, the military stuff," Susan added. "Karen says it makes some people uncomfortable." "Are those people real?" I asked, or only on her email list. Neither of them answered. Instead, Larry held out a new form, an informal letter requesting voluntary suspension of activities that invoke military imagery or disrupt the neighborhood aesthetic. I let the silence build. Then I stepped back, walked into my garage, and came out holding my Navy retirement flag, the one that had flown over my last ship during the decommissioning ceremony. I unfolded it slowly, placed it in their hands, and said quietly, "This flag flew over 800 sailors under my command. If it makes anyone uncomfortable, that's their burden, not mine." They left without another word. But that moment drew a line in the sand. Karen wasn't just picking fights, she was pushing boundaries, testing how far she could go. I knew from years of command that people like her only understood one language: consequences. So I started documenting everything. Emails, complaints, the HOA charter, a growing list of neighbor stories, and I waited. I waited for her to step too far over that invisible line. She didn't make me wait long. Because the very next week, after I received a package from a Navy museum containing a scaled-down deck elevator for my model, which was clearly marked replica, only non-operational, Karen called the police again. And this time, she told them I was constructing weapons. That was the moment I stopped playing nice. The second time the police rolled into my driveway, I was in the middle of unpacking the replica elevator system, carefully removing foam padding and protective wraps from its fragile gears. The thing barely weighed 15 pounds and looked more like a model train component than anything threatening. But there it was, wrapped in caution orange tape from the museum bearing the tag "For Educational Display Only." I had just placed it beside the main deck structure of the carrier model when I heard the tires crunch the gravel. 2 patrol cars this time, same officers as before, Officer Ramirez and his younger partner, Officer Lee. They didn't seem tense, but there was a weariness in their posture, like they already knew the call was going to be nonsense. And yet they had to investigate it. "Good afternoon," Commander Ramirez greeted, his voice steady, but tinged with something like embarrassment. "Gentlemen," I replied, setting my gloves down on the tool bench. Back again, Officer Lee scratched the back of his neck. "We, received another complaint from the HOA. Something about potential weapons assembly on residential property." I didn't even react. Just stepped to the side and pointed to the neatly labeled museum parcel still half wrapped in foam. "That's a scaled deck elevator from a retired museum exhibit. The Truman's Hangar Deck Lift. I'm restoring it for a veterans education display at the local American Legion." Lee exhaled a quiet breath. Ramirez walked closer, bent over the package, read the tags. Educational display, only, he murmured, nodding. Looks like you've got all the proper documentation. I tapped a laminated certificate I had printed from the museum's logistics team. Paperwork chain of custody, even the shipping approval from Norfolk Naval Historical Archive. That's when Karen appeared again. Like clockwork, she came marching down the sidewalk in her tennis whites, clipboard in hand, ponytail bobbing with every indignant step. "Are you seriously just going to let this happen?" she called out. "He's constructing military-grade equipment in a residential garage." Ramirez straightened his body, shifting into something firmer, not aggressive, just assertive. "Ma'am," he said, voice clipped, "this is not military grade. It's a replica component from a public museum. The commander has verified documentation. No laws are being broken." Karen didn't budge. "You're taking his word for it." "No, ma'am," Lee said calmly. "We're taking the U.S. Navy's and the Smithsonian Certified Museum's word for it." For a split second, her eyes darted to the open garage, trying to find anything she could use to reframe her narrative. But there was nothing. Every inch of my workspace was neat labeled and documented. It looked more like a veterans tribute project than a workshop of any threat. I could see it then, that subtle moment when people realize they've lost control, but their pride won't let them back down. She stood straighter, lifted her chin, and tried another angle. "Is he even allowed to conduct public exhibitions from his garage?" she demanded. "This is a residential zone. I'm not conducting exhibitions," I said, calm as ever. "Just restoring a model, as a private citizen, in my private garage." Karen opened her mouth again, but Ramirez cut her off. "Ma'am, I suggest if you have further issues, you take them to civil court. We've responded twice, found no violations, and frankly, these repeated false reports could begin to look like harassment." That landed hard. Karen froze, completely froze, like someone had hit her with a blast of cold air. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. The yoga pants neighbor stepped away slowly. The older gentleman looked at the ground. I gave Karen a nod. "Thank you for your concern. I'll be sure to include this in the updated case file." That night, I received an email from Officer Ramirez, the first officer who had shown up weeks earlier. It read simply, "Commander just wanted to say that some of us see what you're doing and we appreciate it. You keep documenting. We'll keep watching." Ramirez. I sat back in my chair and exhaled. I wasn't doing this for recognition. But there was something deeply affirming about knowing I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found something new in my mailbox, a flyer. HOA quarterly meeting notice. At the bottom was a new agenda item hand-added in ink motion to formally address officer misconduct and unauthorized property use, submitted by Karen Whitmore. She wasn't backing down. She was doubling down. But now she wasn't just annoying me. She was digging herself deeper into a hole, one filled with legal missteps, public embarrassment, and mounting evidence. And I was holding the shovel. The morning of the HOA meeting, I ironed my only navy blue sport coat, the one with brass buttons that reminded me of dress uniforms, though I hadn't worn those in years. I didn't go to these meetings to make a scene. But I had learned that sometimes silence can be mistaken for weakness, and I'd had enough of letting Karen treat this neighborhood like her personal dictatorship. The community center was packed when I arrived. Normally, these meetings drew 5, maybe 6 people, most of them there for the free cookies and half-hearted conversation about garbage pickup. But tonight, the rows were full. Neighbors I hadn't seen since move-in were suddenly present, dressed sharply, eyes alert. Word had spread. The incident with the police, the second one, had made it to the neighborhood's private Facebook group. Someone, I'm guessing, James, had posted a photo of the cruiser lights in my driveway, followed by a long thread from one of the moms on the block detailing how Mr. Delaney got the police called on him for building a toy boat. Toy boat. I laughed when I read that, but I appreciated the spirit. People were waking up. Karen sat at the front table, flanked by her 2 loyal board members. Susan Park, the treasurer who never looked up from her spreadsheets, and Brent Sanderson, secretary, and spineless echo chamber. Karen wore a blazer 3 sizes too tight, her lips pressed into a permanent line of disapproval. Her gavel sat in front of her like a weapon. "Let's bring this meeting to order," she said, tapping once. "We'll begin with old business." For the next 20 minutes, I listened to painfully dry updates about mulch distribution and flower bed grants. Then Karen glanced down at her notes and said with forced casualness, "And finally, we'll address Agenda Item 4, possible misuse of property space and potential community disruption." She looked up. "Mr. Delaney, you've been mentioned in relation to this. Would you care to respond?" I stood slowly, unbuttoned my coat, and walked to the front, not to the microphone, but past it directly in front of the board table. I faced the room. "My name is Commander Jack Delaney, retired. I served 32 years in the United States Navy. For 5 of those, I had the honor of commanding the USS Harry S. Truman, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier with a crew of over 5,000. We ran relief missions, evacuated civilians from war zones, delivered aid to hurricane victims, and yes, we conducted military operations on behalf of this nation." The room had gone still. I moved to Elm Ridge not to show off my past, but to live in peace, to build a home. But since the day I arrived, I've been followed, fined, surveilled, and reported to law enforcement twice for building a museum-grade model in my own garage. A murmur ran through the room. I continued pulling from my satchel the clear binder I had prepared. "Here is documentation for every shipment, every component, every clearance. Here are the police reports, the photos, the audio recordings. Here is the official response from the Naval History and Heritage Command, approving my use of the deck replica for educational purposes." I placed the binder down on the front table with an audible thud. Karen tried to keep her expression neutral, but her fingers fidgeted at the edge of the table. Then I took out the final item, a framed letter signed by the mayor himself, a formal commendation. After the second false report, I contacted an old friend, Mayor Jameson. Years ago, my carrier crew coordinated a rescue during an earthquake relief mission in Southeast Asia. He was there. He remembers. I turned the frame toward the audience. He issued this, not as a favor, but because what's happening in this neighborhood is wrong. Karen's voice cracked slightly. "This isn't about your resume, Mr. Delaney. This is about protocol." I turned to face her fully. "Protocol is what I lived by every day for 3 decades. You think you understand chain of command accountability. You've weaponized a position that's meant to serve. You've called the police on veterans, single mothers, and dog owners." Gasps from the back. A few nodded. James raised a fist, subtle but steady. Karen's face flushed. "This is out of order." I took a slow breath. "You're out of order. And now the entire neighborhood knows it." Silence reigned for a long moment. Then something remarkable happened. A woman in the second row, Janet, a quiet school librarian I'd only waved to before, stood up. "I move to table this item indefinitely," she said, "and to open a motion for an internal review of the HOA board." Karen's jaw dropped. "That's not, it is..." Susan Park cut in quietly. She didn't look at Karen. "It's within our bylaws." Brent blinked as if woken from a dream. "Wait, what?" A dozen hands went up. "Seconded," several people said in unison. Karen gavelled furiously. "No, this meeting is adjourned." But it was too late. The room had already shifted. The energy belonged to the residents. Now not the rulebook. I picked up my binder, nodded once to the crowd, and returned to my seat. The meeting broke up in a flurry of whispered conversations, pointed glances, and small groups forming in corners. I didn't say much afterward. Just shook hands, accepted quiet thank you, and walked back home under the gentle flicker of porch lights. When I reached my front door, I turned once more to glance down the block. Karen stood in her driveway, alone, arms folded tight. The clipboard was gone. For the first time since I moved in, I slept with my windows open. The neighborhood had finally taken a breath. The day after the HOA meeting, I thought things might finally settle. Karen had been publicly challenged, the board's authority questioned, and the neighborhood awakened. But what I didn't expect was the knock on my door the next morning. It was still early, before the sun had climbed over the pine trees lining Elm Ridge Drive. I had just poured a mug of coffee when I heard it, a firm, confident knock. Not the tap-tap hesitation of a neighbor. It was the kind of knock that carried weight, like whoever was on the other side knew they had something important to say. When I opened the door, I blinked once, then smiled. "Mayor Jameson," I said, extending my hand. "I wasn't expecting you in person." He returned the handshake with the solid grip of a man who'd been in more disaster zones than city hall meetings. He looked older than I remembered, more gray in the beard, deeper lines around the eyes, but still held himself like someone used to issuing orders when lives were on the line. "Jack," he said with a small nod, "heard you've stirred up a hornet's nest out here." "I didn't start it," I replied, stepping aside. "But I might have kicked it hard enough to wake the hive." He chuckled and walked in. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the framed commendations on the wall and the display shelf with miniature aircraft I'd collected over decades. "You always did run a tight ship," he said, "even at home." We sat on the porch with our coffee, the morning still and cool around us. He didn't waste time with small talk. "I read every page of your complaint," he said. "Your documentation is airtight. If even half of what Karen's done can be verified through witness statements, that HOA board is in serious trouble. She's used their charter like a cudgel," I said. "Turned a voluntary role into a weapon." The sad part is most people let her. They were either too busy, too afraid, or too beaten down to fight back. Jameson leaned forward, elbows on knees. "That's exactly why I'm here." I waited. He took a sip, then looked at me with something close to apology. HOAs like this one don't just fall apart because of a bad leader. They rot from within because no one checks them. The city doesn't get involved unless there's a formal complaint. Until now, there hasn't been one that stuck. Your file, it sticks, and it sets precedent. He reached into his jacket and handed me an envelope, city letterhead, stamped and sealed. "We're opening an administrative review, not just of Elm Ridge HOA, but of 5 others in the area. You cracked something open here." I opened the envelope and read Municipal Oversight Investigation initiated per citizen complaint, CMDR, Jack Delaney, Reta. "Why the others?" I asked. Jameson's expression darkened. "Because this isn't isolated. Karen has friends. Other HOA presidents who operate the same way, targeting veterans, minorities, older residents without family to back them up. We've gotten whispers. Your complaint gives us leverage." I sat back in my chair, let the words settle. "Let me guess," I said. "She's already contacted you." He smiled without humor. "Oh yes. Left a voicemail last night calling your conduct reckless, your presence in the community disruptive, and your model carrier a threat to the visual cohesion of Elm Ridge." Her words. "I'd say she's consistent, at least." Jameson chuckled. "She also demanded I remove you from city advisory boards, which, as you know, you're not even on." She's grasping. "She's drowning," he corrected. "And she's dragging that entire HOA board with her." We finished our coffee in silence, listening to the neighborhood stir, awake sprinklers sputtering on dogs, barking garage doors rising. Jameson stood, buttoned his jacket. "I'll be attending the next HOA meeting," he said, "not as mayor, but as a witness. Your neighbors need to see this is bigger than one bad leader." I walked him out to the curb. "You've got my support always." He paused at his car, looked at me one last time. "Jack," he said, "you spent most of your life defending this country overseas. But sometimes the fight comes home, and it's just as important." After he drove off, I stood for a long moment on the lawn, watching the sunlight spill over the roofs, warm and golden. Something had shifted, not just in the HOA, not just in the legal realm, but in the soul of this street. People were beginning to believe they had the right to peace, to dignity, to a life without the constant shadow of arbitrary power. And Karen, for the first time, she was afraid. Not because I had shouted, not because I had threatened her, but because I had outlasted her, with truth, with patience, and with every last bit of naval discipline I'd carried home with me. By noon, I'd received 4 emails from neighbors, 2 sharing stories of their own HOA run-ins, one offering to testify, and the last one simply saying, "Thank you for standing up. You made us feel like we weren't crazy." Later that afternoon, I returned to my garage. I wiped down the carrier model, adjusted the deck lighting, and started planning the next edition, an animated flight deck crew custom painted by hand. The kind of project I once dreamed of doing, now with a new purpose, to teach, to remember, and maybe to inspire. Because the battle wasn't over. but for the first time, it felt like we were winning. The days following the mayor's visit moved with a strange kind of energy, like the neighborhood had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. For the first time since I moved in, I saw people stop mid-walk to wave. Neighbors lingered longer at the mailboxes. There were clusters of quiet conversations at corners, shared glances, even a few tentative smiles. It felt like the spell had broken. And then the local news van showed up. I was in my front yard trimming a boxwood hedge when the white van with Channel 12 local watch printed on the side rolled into Elm Ridge. It parked 2 houses down, and a tall woman with sharp features and a professional calm stepped out, followed by a camera guy already adjusting his lens. I sighed, wiped my hands, and waited. It didn't take long. "Commander Delaney," she asked, walking up the path with practiced charm. "My name's Carly Shaw. We're covering community stories around the county, and yours, well, it's gotten some attention." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the man builds toy boat Karen panics story?" She laughed softly. "Among others. We've received a half-dozen tips in the last 48 hours about misconduct in this HOA. Apparently yours was just the first domino." I considered. Media wasn't my style. I preferred quiet battles, documents, strategy, letting the facts speak. But something told me this wasn't just about me anymore. "I'll speak," I said. But no edits, no sensationalism, just the truth. She nodded, and 30 minutes later, I was standing in front of my garage doors, wide open model carrier, visible behind me, answering questions about naval service community harassment and what it meant to quietly fight back. The segment aired that same evening. The headline read, "Veteran Harassed by HOA President for Tribute Project Mayor and Neighbors Step In." It went viral within the county by the next morning. Emails poured in. Former service members from neighboring suburbs, teachers, retirees. One message came from a woman who had lived in Elm Ridge 20 years ago. She wrote, "She did the same thing to my father when he planted a small vegetable garden. I always regretted not standing up. Thank you for doing what we didn't." It wasn't just words. The very next HOA meeting tripled in size. Folding chairs spilled into the hallways. Neighbors brought clipboards, highlighted bylaws, and their own documentation. People weren't there to listen anymore. They came ready to speak. Karen was already seated at the front when I arrived. Her face rigid, her voice tight as she called the meeting to order. But the control she once held was visibly slipping. Her motions rushed, her tone brittle. The first blow came from Martha. She stood near the back, held up a packet of papers, and declared in a clear, unwavering voice, "For the record, I've compiled a list of 18 instances where fines were issued without board approval. All signed by Mrs. Whitmore." Karen flushed. "That's a gross mischaracterization. It's notarized," Martha interrupted, "and submitted to the city's review committee. I'm just making sure the community hears it too." A round of claps broke out, not loud but steady, solid. The second blow came from Mr. Patterson, a quiet man who'd never spoken at any meeting before. He stood shoulders trembling and recounted how he'd received 5 violation notices in a single month for alleged trash can mishandling, even though he had photos proving the bins were placed exactly where the rules stated. "It made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home," he said, voice breaking. "And I stayed quiet because I didn't think anyone would care. They cared now." I listened, letting their voices build a wave. It wasn't mine to command anymore. It belonged to the people Karen had silenced. Still, when I rose to speak near the end, the room hushed. Eyes turned toward me, not out of fear, but hope. "I didn't come here looking for a fight," I said. "I came here to retire to build something with my hands to live quietly. But peace isn't something we're handed. It's something we protect for each other." I turned to Karen. "This board was meant to serve, not to rule. We trusted you with the power to preserve our community. You used it to preserve control. That ends now." Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She was a soldier, with no troops, a queen without her court. The room had moved on. She just hadn't accepted it yet. That evening, the HOA board received a petition formally signed by more than 60% of the residents calling for a full leadership vote per the HOA charter. The special election would be held in 2 weeks. Karen tried in the days that followed to reclaim the narrative. She posted statements to the community page, accusing certain elements of orchestrating a smear campaign. But the comments beneath each post grew colder, sharper. People asked questions, shared receipts, pasted citations from bylaws Karen had once twisted to silence them. Then came the moment that changed everything. I received an email from an anonymous account. Attached was a PDF. It contained scanned pages of internal HOA communication emails between Karen and a private security consultant discussing how to place cameras strategically to monitor non-compliant homes, particularly those belonging to single-dwellers renters, and this one made my stomach turn residents with visible veteran paraphernalia. There was even a line that read, "Delaney's presence is a threat to social order. He brings a military mentality incompatible with suburban cohesion." I forwarded it directly to the city attorney's office. Within 24 hours, an official statement was issued by the mayor's office confirming that an ethics investigation had been opened against the HOA board for abuse of power, targeted harassment, and unlawful surveillance practices. The tide hadn't just turned. It was washing her out. In the Navy, we had a saying, "You never go into open waters without reading the weather." Out here in this quiet little corner of suburbia, the weather wasn't measured in barometric pressure or storm patterns. It was measured in legal documents, council rulings, and public sentiment. And the winds were changing fast. The HOA special election was now less than a week away. Karen's public image was unraveling by the hour, and the leak of her internal emails had confirmed what so many of us already knew in our bones, that this wasn't about community standards. It was about control, plain and simple. But I didn't want her just voted out. I wanted her exposed for what she had become, a petty tyrant who had weaponized technicalities to bully veterans' families and working-class folks into silence. And for that, I needed precision. I needed firepower. Legal firepower. That's when I called an old friend, Commander Miles Barrett, retired JAG officer. We served together during a particularly tense deployment in the Strait of Hormuz. While I was coordinating deck operations, he was fighting battles in briefing rooms and military courtrooms across the globe. We hadn't spoken in 5 years, but he answered on the second ring. "Jack Delaney," he said. "Tell me you finally got into trouble so I can come rescue you for once." I laughed. "Close." "You ever litigate against an HOA? Hell yes," he said. "And I love every minute of it." "What's the situation?" I explained everything. Karen's citations, the false police reports, the internal emails, the HOA's lack of transparency, the city's investigation, and the special election just days away. There was a long pause. Then Miles said, "Send me everything. Tonight, I'll draw up an affidavit and have a cease and desist ready before lunch tomorrow. If you want to go nuclear, Jack, I'll bring the launch codes." So I did. I scanned every document, every fine, every letter, every police report. I even included photos of neighbors' properties and their matching violation notices patterns so obvious, even a rookie intern could connect the dots. By noon the next day, Miles had filed an official cease and desist on behalf of several residents, including myself, alleging harassment, misuse of HOA funds, and civil rights violations. He also submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain surveillance footage and board communications for the past 2 years. And that's when the real unraveling began. The city clerk's office confirmed that no official meeting minutes had been submitted by the HOA in over 26 months, violating both local ordinances and their own charter. The HOA bank statements, which were required to be publicly accessible upon written request, had never once been shared with the general membership. And when pressed, Karen claimed they had been lost in a system update. Meanwhile, Miles dug deeper and discovered that the HOA had paid over $8,000 in consulting services to a firm owned by Karen's brother-in-law, none of which were approved through resident voting or board consensus. I brought this up at a public forum hosted by the mayor himself. Channel 12 was there along with 3 other news crews from around the region. I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid out the facts. The HOA has fined veterans for flags called police on model ships and spent thousands of dollars without disclosure or consent. And yet we're told this is about community harmony. Let me be clear, harmony built on fear is not harmony at all. It's coercion. The mayor didn't say much that night. He didn't have to. The crowd spoke for itself, rising to their feet in applause. Karen didn't show up, but her lawyer did. The next morning, we received a letter from her counsel attempting to dismiss the allegations as misunderstandings taken out of context, weaponized by disgruntled residents. Miles responded with a 2-line email. Your client's time would be better spent preparing for deposition. We're not interested in semantics. We're interested in accountability. Then came the audit. At the mayor's request, the city assigned an independent auditor to review all HOA financial activity from the past 5 years. Within 72 hours, preliminary findings showed over $18,000 in miscellaneous charges with no supporting invoices. Among the items listed, $900 for conference travel to a wellness resort in Sedona, Arizona, $250. Consulting lunch at a 5-star steakhouse, $100 for community aesthetic improvement, which turned out to be a new garden fountain at Karen's house. The neighborhood was livid. People who had once whispered behind fences were now standing together on porches, speaking openly at mailbox clusters and organizing over group chats that had previously lain dormant. Even those who had remained neutral were now stepping up, penning letters, signing affidavits, demanding reform. The momentum was undeniable. And Karen, she did what cornered people often do. She lashed out. On the eve of the special election, she sent a mass email to every resident in the HOA mailing list, a rambling, unhinged message filled with accusations, self-praise, and conspiracy theories about how certain elements were trying to take over Elm Ridge for their own anarchist agenda. It didn't land the way she hoped. A few people replied, simply asking, "Did you use HOA funds to send this?" Others forwarded the email to the mayor's office. And when it was leaked to the press, Channel 12 ran a segment comparing her tone to that of a desperate regime clinging to power in its final hour. That night, I sat on my porch as the sun set over the rooftops, casting golden light across the street. Martha brought over a pitcher of lemonade. James brought his old radio and played a crackling recording of Sinatra. And across the street for the first time, Karen's windows were dark. No porch light, no clipboard, no car in the driveway. It was quiet, peaceful. The kind of evening I had imagined when I moved here. But I knew tomorrow would be the true test, because tomorrow was the vote. And this time the neighborhood wasn't staying home. Election day arrived like a thunderclap wrapped in sunshine. It was one of those rare mornings in early autumn where the air had just the right bite crisp, but not cold, still tinged with the tail-end warmth of summer. The kind of morning that almost made you forget you were about to walk into a room charged with weeks, no, years of repressed tension, buried fear, and unspoken resentment. But I didn't forget. I woke early, brewed coffee, and ironed a simple white shirt. No blazer this time, no medals, just me showing up like any other neighbor. The community center opened at 8:00 a.m., and by 8:05, the line wrapped around the building. Young couples with toddlers on hips, retirees with clipboards and smiles, veterans in caps with insignias stitched in faded thread. I recognized nearly every face, and I think in some quiet way, they all recognized each other again too. Because for the first time in years, we weren't just residents. We were a community. The voting itself was straightforward, 3 ballots per household, 1 for HOA president, 1 for board restructure approval, and 1 for proposed transparency reforms. Ballots were anonymous, sealed, and counted by an independent moderator appointed by the mayor's office. Karen showed up just before 10. She wore sunglasses and a scarf, as if trying to deflect attention, though it had the opposite effect. People stepped aside not out of fear anymore, but out of frozen politeness. Nobody greeted her. Nobody made eye contact. She moved through the line like a ghost already haunting a house she no longer owned. I didn't speak to her. She didn't look my way. By noon, over 80% of the neighborhood had voted, an unprecedented turnout. I returned home, changed into jeans, and went back to my workshop, For the next 2 hours, I painted tiny figures for the deck of my carrier model. It was therapeutic, steady, purposeful, something I could control. The vote count began at 4:00 p.m. and took less than an hour. At exactly 5:09 p.m., I received a phone call from Curtis at the city clerk's office. "It's done," he said. 91% in favor of full board removal. 95% for the transparency reforms. Karen lost the presidency by 87%. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just closed my eyes and let the air fill my lungs. That evening, the HOA posted a statement to the community website. Effective immediately, the current board has been dissolved. A transitional committee, overseen by the city, will manage HOA operations until new elections are scheduled. All financial activity from the past 5 years will be subject to public audit. There was no signature from Karen, because Karen was gone. She left the neighborhood 2 days later. A moving van appeared before dawn, followed by a black SUV. She didn't say goodbye. No one helped her pack. She disappeared as quickly as she had controlled, like a cloud lifting after a long, oppressive storm. But the story didn't end with her exit, because victory isn't just removal, it's rebuilding. In the following weeks, we held open forums in the community center. We invited every resident to speak, whether they had lived here for 30 years or 3 months. We rewrote the bylaws with clarity, fairness, and checks on board power. We created a rotating advisory panel that included renters, seniors, veterans, and even teenagers with a vote on aesthetic guidelines. And yes, I was asked to serve on the Interim Reform Council. I hesitated at first. But then, I thought about that first letter Karen sent me, folded and bold-typed and unsigned. I thought about the dog fines, the flag removals, the women in tears after being told their gardens disrupted neighborhood unity. I thought about all the people who had sat silent for too long. And I said yes. My first act was simple. We approved a Heritage Yard Display Clause 1 that protected military memorials, educational exhibits, and cultural heritage decorations year-round without board override. The second, we voted to rename the community garden Unity Grove. James and Martha now run it every Saturday morning. As for me, I finally finished the USS Truman model. She sits in a glass case in the front hall of the local American Legion post, surrounded by small plaques, each one bearing the names of neighbors who contributed, some with stories, others with hands. At the dedication ceremony, the mayor stood next to me and said, "Sometimes leadership isn't about standing in front, it's about refusing to step back." But I knew better. Leadership, I'd learned, was about standing with people who thought they had no voice, and helping them speak louder than fear. As the ceremony wrapped up, a teenage boy approached. He lived 3 houses down, quiet kid, always skateboarding in the afternoons. He looked at the model ship, then at me. "You really commanded one of those?" he asked. I smiled. "Yeah, for a long time." His eyes lit up. "That's so cool." He turned to walk away but stopped. "Thanks for not letting her win," he said. My mom said she used to cry after those letters. We didn't know what to do. I didn't have an answer, so I just nodded. Because that, more than the vote, more than the headlines, more than the plaque on the wall, that was justice. The quiet kind, the kind that heals. The seasons began to change again, leaves fading to gold school buses, resuming their rumble through Elm Ridge, and evening porch lights flickering on, not in paranoia, but peace. There was a noticeable stillness in the neighborhood now, not the tense kind that had settled under Karen's rule, but the kind that signaled balance had returned. The kind of silence that comes after a storm, when everything is washed clean and you finally hear the birds again. I'd walk in the early mornings, just like I used to on the flight deck before sunrise. Only now I wore sneakers instead of steel-toe boots. Neighbors waved. Kids nodded respectfully, some still too shy to say hello, but their glances held curiosity, now not fear. One young boy, maybe 10, left a tiny origami ship on my porch one morning with a note, "For your fleet, sir." It stayed on my mantle. The HOA Reform Council met every other week in the community center, not under fluorescent lights with frowning faces, but with coffee laughter and open discussion. We weren't perfect. Disagreements still happened, of course. But now they were civil. People spoke, others listened, and decisions were made together. The transparency reforms passed without resistance. We created a public portal for all HOA finances, implemented term limits, and mandated community votes for any budget above 500. Simple changes, but profound ones. The biggest shift, however, was the culture. People began putting up decorations again, flags, wind chimes, little garden gnomes that would have earned them Karen's wrath a year ago. James and Martha's porch now had an entire miniature train village circling a flower bed, and no one wrote a single complaint letter. I still remember the first community potluck after the election. It was held under the oaks by the playground, the one Karen had once tried to restrict to reduce liability exposure. Everyone brought something: barbecue ribs, peach cobbler, Filipino lumpia, Persian rice, chicken salad, even vegan chili. Someone brought a karaoke machine. It was the most joy I had seen in this place since moving in. That night, as the sun dipped low and paper lanterns glowed softly overhead, Curtis from City Hall raised a glass of sweet tea and gave a quiet toast. To Commander Delaney, he said, for reminding us that silence doesn't mean peace, and that justice, real justice, is sometimes found right here at home. I shook my head and stood. No, I said, justice doesn't need a commander. It just needs a community willing to stop bowing to fear. The applause was quiet but heartfelt, the kind that doesn't need volume to carry weight. Later that week, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I didn't understand the damage I caused until it was too late. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, but in truth, I was trying to control it. You didn't destroy me. You saved me from becoming something worse. KW. I folded the letter once and slipped it into the back of my binder. Not as a trophy, just as a reminder. Sometimes even those who hurt us the most are carrying wounds they never learned to name. Karen moved to a quieter community on the edge of town. Word was she took up painting. I don't know if she ever spoke of Elm Ridge again, and I'm not sure I need her to, because the real legacy wasn't hers. It belonged to the young couple who now hosts movie nights on their driveway, projecting Pixar films on a bedsheet for the neighborhood kids. To the elderly woman who no longer hides her garden behind hedges. To the veterans who now hold monthly meetups without fear of being reported for unauthorized gatherings. And to every neighbor who once whispered but now speaks. As for me, I still build, not just models anymore, but bridges between people, between stories, between what was and what could be. Last month, I was asked to speak at the local high school civics class. The teacher, a woman named Angela, said her students had watched the news segment and wanted to meet the guy who stood up to the HOA. I told them I wasn't brave, just tired. Tired of watching good people get stepped on because they thought rules were always right, because they mistook silence for strength. But you were a commander, one student said. That must have helped. I smiled. Yes, but not in the way you think. And I told them what leadership really meant. Not shouting, not orders, not power. But knowing when to stand still while the storm raged, and when to walk forward anyway. And maybe, just maybe, reminding others they could do the same. When I got home that afternoon, a small envelope was waiting in the mailbox. Inside was a Polaroid. It showed 3 kids gathered around the model of the USS Truman at the American Legion Hall. One of them, freckled, grinning, was pointing to the tiny flight deck crew I'd painted. Scrawled on the back in messy child handwriting were 3 words, "Your ship sails." I stood on my porch a long time after that, watching the sunset settle over Elm Ridge. The houses glowed in warm orange light, quiet and content. No patrol cars, no fines. Just laughter, echoing down the street. And for the first time since I'd hung up my uniform, I felt something deeper than pride. I felt home.